Arvind Ravikumar, and I will speak louder so you can hear me. So as you know, you run a conference and things go wrong. And so we have an exciting reason to pivot to Arvind being remote, which is that he was called away to speak before Senate. So he was still kind enough to join us today, and he's going to present on making sense of data, accurate carbon accounting. So welcome, Arvind.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with all of you here at the UT Energy Week. My only regret is that I couldn't be there in person, but Brian and his team have been incredibly helpful. I informed them late last week that I was called to the Senate to testify, and I might have to do this virtually, and they made it happen without any challenges. All right. So my name is Arvind Ravikumar. I'm the co-director of the Energy Emissions Modeling and Data Lab at UT Austin. I'm going to be talking about carbon accounting across energy supply chains. I cannot tell you what the price of oil is going to be a year from now. I cannot tell you if we'll achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. But what I'm going to talk about today is a very technical topic, carbon accounting across energy supply chains. And it's become really important for the success of many policies, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, just in the past 5 years. Now, 5 years ago, if you had asked me how important is accurate carbon accounting, not that important. There were not a lot of policies in the US and around the world that required very specific high-resolution information on carbon emissions across energy supply chains. But just over the past few years, with developments in the US and in Europe, things have changed. And I'm going to show you maybe the first 15 to 20 minutes places where carbon accounting becomes really important. And then towards the second half of my presentation, I'll talk a bit about what we are doing here at UT Austin to address the challenge and give you some examples of how we have already worked with energy companies as well as regulatory agencies to think about much more detailed carbon accounting across our energy supply chains. The global emissions are increasingly coming under net zero pledges. Now, if you just look at the 24 months between January 2020 and November 2021, what you'll find is that the share of global emissions that is under some sort of net zero discussion increased from about 34% just at the start of the pandemic to 89% by the end of 2021. And you can see on the right, the number of countries that is having some kind of discussion about carbon neutrality. Just last year, India announced net zero emissions by about 2070. And so there's an increasing momentum towards addressing carbon emissions around mid-century. In parallel, there's been significant global momentum to address methane emissions as a near-term climate solution. In fact, this is one of the areas that's most interesting because it's where the policymaker, the industry, and the scientists are all working together to address some of the biggest challenges that we have seen in this space. At COP26, led by the United States and the European Union, over 100 countries pledged to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. The Environmental Protection Agency, as we speak, is finalizing regulations to address methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. In fact, if you looked at the comments that have been submitted to the EPA, many of the giants in the energy industry are in support of these methane regulations. At the same time, there's been significant investments in new technology and innovation by the Department of Energy. These investments started around 2004, 2005, 2006. Right now, many of those technologies that received funding from the Department of Energy are some of the fastest growing startups in the space. And many of you in the audience might even know of some of these companies and might work with them regularly to measure methane emissions. What these technologies and these innovation is doing is that it's democratizing methane emissions information. Now, until very recently, the only way you knew about methane emissions is to do the same calculations as what the EPA did, or look at what the operators are reporting to the EPA on what their methane emissions are. But now we don't need to do that. There are technologies like satellites where all you have to do is point that satellite at a facility and you're going to find out what its methane emissions are. In parallel, organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund and Carbon Mapper are undertaking surveys of US oil and gas infrastructure to measure methane emissions and make that data public. So there's going to be a proliferation of data that's coming very soon to better inform us about methane emissions across oil and gas supply chains. Each facility is a very, very small part of the problem, but collectively, methane is a huge issue. If you just look at global energy sector methane emissions, that's just methane from coal, oil, gas, and a little bit of bioenergy, what you'll find is that it would be the third largest emitter, only after the United States and China. In 2021, global methane emissions were about 3,400 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is greater than India's total greenhouse gas emissions. So collectively, it's a big problem. So how do we take that big problem, break it out into smaller chunks, and address emissions from the oil and gas supply chain? All right. So what are the key features of oil and gas methane emissions that are critical to developing sort of what I call low leakage supply chains? The first one is that methane emissions vary widely across operators, basins, and countries. Emissions in the Permian Basin is very different from emissions in the Marcellus Basin. Similarly, emissions in the US is very different from emissions from other countries like Russia. Methane emissions are dominated by a small number of super-emitters. So what this really means is that a very small number of emitters cause the majority of your emissions. So the challenge of addressing methane mitigation is to find these super-emitters fast and fix them. And what makes it challenging is that they're often short duration events, which means they are intermittent and unpredictable. What we have also learned recently from research is that conventional inventory methods underestimate emissions. They do not account for super-emitters or their time-varying nature. And the last thing, and this is where a lot of promise is being seen, is that there are new technologies and innovations that are promising cost-effective methane monitoring. One example is using multi-scale measurements, including things like satellites, aerial systems, drones, continuous monitoring systems, can quickly reduce these super-emitters. So here's an example of what I just told you. Now, emissions vary significantly across basins. What you're seeing on this map is methane emissions, average methane emissions from recent publications and measurements across different basins. What you're seeing is a variety. So you have methane emissions as low as 0.5% in Wyoming and 1% in the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, to as high as 6% in the Bakken Shale in North Dakota and 4% in the Permian Basin in Texas. What this translates to is that supply chain emissions intensity can vary by a factor of 3. So whether you get your natural gas from the Marcellus Shale Basin or you get it from the Permian Basin makes a huge difference on what your supply chain emissions intensity is going to be. And accurately accounting for methane emissions is challenging because of intermittency. What you're seeing in this animation is methane emissions in the Barnett Shale Basin, which is around Dallas-Fort Worth area. What you're seeing are spikes. So these are short duration methane emission events that we just talked about. These are intermittent, they're unpredictable, and they're short duration. So the question is, when methane emissions are varying like this, how do you get an accurate estimate of methane emissions at the annual level? Because if you look at policies that require carbon accounting, it's not about what are your emissions at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday. It's what are your emissions on average for 2021, or what's your emissions intensity for a given supply chain. So you have to take the data that you're seeing, the animations that you're seeing right now, which are short duration emission events that you might measure maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 times a year, and convert that into information that's actually used in a policy or a business context. So that remains a big challenge. And the next challenge is with this proliferation of all these new technologies, how do you interpret data from different types of systems to provide you with useful information? As an example, you have technologies that operate on the ground, so that are on your facilities. These can be handheld cameras, these can be installed fence line monitors or other types of continuous sensors. They help you flag emission events and direct potential follow-up action. At the next level, you have drones. Drones are very good because they can tell you, they fly about 10 to 30 feet off the ground, and they can tell you what emissions are at individual equipment, and you can use that to compare with what your emissions inventory says. The next level is aerial systems. They can fly anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 feet. You put a sensor inside a plane and fly around, and their advantage is that they're fast. So they can cover multiple sites on a single day, even hundreds of sites depending on site density. And so they are helpful in getting fast repeat measurement surveys to quantify site emissions. And then, of course, you have satellites. Many of them are low Earth orbit satellites around 100 to 150 miles from the surface of the Earth, and they are helpful in regional monitoring and long-term monitoring of asset portfolio. What you see here is that different kinds of technologies give you different kinds of data. And so the question is, when it comes to policies, what is your annual emissions or what is your supply chain emissions intensity? The question becomes, how do you put data from all of these very different systems together? And why is it important? I'm going to give you some examples of why it's important now to think about effective carbon accounting. So two key provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. One is the implementation of the methane fee, and the second one is updating US greenhouse gas inventories using empirical data. So methane fees, as some of you might know, is something that's assessed on operators' methane emissions that are emitting beyond a certain threshold. So the question is then, how do you develop accurate annualized emissions intensity estimates from measurements? And this cannot be done at the national level or the state level. This has to be done at the operator level and the asset level. It's one thing if we want to know what is the average methane emissions across the US. We know it's about 2 to 2.5%. But it's much harder to talk about what is the emissions intensity of an individual facility, of an individual operator in the given basin. So how do you do that? And you need something like that for the methane fees to be successfully implemented. And this is related to the second provision in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is updating US greenhouse gas inventories with empirical data. We know that the official reporting program, such as the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program by the EPA, does not include all sources of methane emissions. So what Congress did is direct the EPA to use measurements to improve greenhouse gas emissions inventories. It's easier to say that in the rule. It's 2 sentences in a 1,000-page rule, but it's a really challenging problem. How do you develop the models and the protocols needed to implement a measurement-based greenhouse gas inventory? This has never been done before. And this is something we're going to need for the future, where provisions like the methane fee will require updated greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So this is an example of why accounting is going to become really important. So one of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act is a tax credit for production of hydrogen. And what the law says is that if your life cycle emissions associated with hydrogen production is less than 4 kilogram CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen, you are eligible for subsidies. So what we did was we looked at, if you want to produce blue hydrogen, which for those who might not know, hydrogen that's produced from natural gas using steam methane reforming and then using carbon capture to prevent the CO2 from entering the atmosphere. So what we wanted to look at is, where will blue hydrogen production be eligible for these tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act? And so what you're seeing on this figure are modeling of blue hydrogen production from gas sourced in the Marcellus shale basin on the left and gas sourced in the Permian basin on the right. So there are two major variables that we have control over. One is supply chain methane leakage, which is on the y-axis, and the other is carbon capture rate. Now, you can have capture rates of anywhere between 80 to 95%. But because we know that methane emissions vary quite a bit between these different basins, what we see here is striking. If you take what the current levels of methane leakage are in the Marcellus basin, as well as achievable carbon capture rate, what you find is that blue hydrogen production in the Marcellus shale basin today will be eligible for tax credits because the life cycle emissions will be less than 4 kilograms CO2e per kilogram hydrogen. If you take the same technology and put it in Texas, in the Permian basin, and you source gas from the Permian basin, that blue hydrogen will not be eligible for tax credits. And that's because methane emissions in the supply chain from the Permian basin are higher than methane emissions in the supply chain from the Marcellus basin. So policies like this are now going to require us to do much better carbon accounting at a high spatial and temporal resolution. It's not good enough to just say US methane emissions is 2.5%, it's lower than other countries. We have to start talking about, for individual projects, in this example, a blue hydrogen project, exactly what the supply chain emissions are going to be, and therefore, what kind of tax credits and other incentives will it be eligible for. So it becomes a very project-specific estimation of greenhouse gases. Another example, and this is now coming on the voluntary side. There are markets for differentiated natural gas and other voluntary approaches that are dependent on availability of accurate emissions information. The Department of Energy hosted a roundtable at CERAWeek last month or earlier this month to talk about what differentiated natural gas means. And there are different approaches here. And there are certifications that provide assurances of low methane emissions. We have MIQ and Project Canary that do that. There are monitoring, reporting, and verification programs, or MRV programs. This is prominent in methane, but this is also something that's going to come in carbon capture and other sorts of carbon emissions. There are several organizations that develop these protocols. In the US, we have GTA Veritas. Internationally, we have the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. We also have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that many companies use to report their greenhouse gas emissions. And then more recently, we have things like digital certificates and registries to enable trade in low leakage natural gas. Irrespective of what form these voluntary markets take, all of it are going to require accurate supply chain greenhouse gas emissions information. And it should be information that must be trusted by a lot of different stakeholders. It must be trusted by the industry. It must be trusted by buyers, by regulatory agencies, and the broader public to have credibility in any of these voluntary approaches. And building trust requires transparency, and that's a real challenge. And so what is the fundamental challenge in interpreting methane emissions information? So the question for us is, how are greenhouse gas emissions measurements made through various methods, various technologies, used to create actionable information that is reliable, transparent, trusted, and timely? If folks in the audience have rented a car, one of the things that's currently available right now is you could pay $1.50 to offset all of your emissions associated with the rental car. And I haven't yet met a single person who actually believes that $1.50 is going to offset all of your greenhouse gas emissions from that rental. And so what's needed is not just a mechanism to know what the supply chain emissions are. We have to make sure that mechanism is trusted. And so here's the problem. On the left is what we have right now. Many companies are doing multi-scale measurements via various protocols and methods, both in the US and around the world. You use satellites, aircraft, ground-based systems, continuous monitors, etc. These are all data that you're collecting. Data does not mean information. What you need is information that's on the right. What kind of information? Broadly speaking, we need things like emissions inventories. What is the annual measurement-informed emissions inventory of individual assets? And you will need supply chain emissions estimates or supply chain emissions intensities for things like estimating eligibility for tax credits for hydrogen production. So the question is, how do you go from what's on the left, which is data, to what's on the right, which is information? So what you're going to need is a common language or framework to interpret emissions measurements undertaken using various technologies around the globe. And this has to be transparent, reliable, timely, and based on the principle of continuous improvement. And I stress the point of continuous improvement because you don't need these framework and the models that are perfect that will come to you maybe 10 years from now. You need these models and frameworks for tomorrow. And so you start with what we have, and then you improve them over time as we get better data and better information on supply chain greenhouse gas emissions. And thankfully, the national academies in the US came out with a report late last year just talking about this exact problem and specifying the kind of features you need for this framework that helps us interpret data to provide useful information. And some of those principles are that framework needs to be transparent, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be scientifically robust, and it needs to be user-friendly. There's no point in having models and frameworks that you need 25 PhDs to run. You need something that anyone can use across the supply chain, small operator or a big operator. And so this is where the initiative that Dave Allen and I are heading, the Energy Emissions Modeling and Data Lab, comes into the picture. We want to develop some of those models and frameworks to help with accurate carbon accounting. And our goal is to be a data analytics hub to support improved greenhouse gas emissions accounting across energy supply chains. So it's 3 universities, University of Texas at Austin, Colorado State, and Colorado School of Mines. And we want to do 3 things. The first one, as I just talked about, models, tools, and methods. We want to create that methods and the framework that helps us go from all of the data that we're collecting to useful information that can be part of policies. So we want to develop the tools to improve regional, national, and global emissions inventories using measurement-informed approaches. And these are tools that will be available to the community. We'll develop these tools, we'll make them public. Now anyone can take these tools and use them. And I'll give you some examples of how some of the tools we have built is currently used by the EPA and other agencies. The point is to make sure that the common framework and the language I talked about is available to everyone so that there's some trust built into the numbers that we need. Things like carbon emissions intensity and supply chain emissions information. In addition, we'll make data sets public. So we'll provide high resolution and reliable measurement-based data sets on methane emissions across supply chains. There's been a lot of measurements just over the past 5 years. Many of them are public, many of them are funded by the Department of Energy, but there's also a lot of measurements done by oil and gas companies internally. None of the data are public for good reasons. And so one of the things we are going to do is, because we are going to get data from several operators, we are able to effectively aggregate them, anonymize them, and make them public. The advantage is that you get to see how emissions across different basins, across different supply chains are actually reducing, which helps us not just within the US to track our progress in reducing methane emissions, but it also helps us internationally, and which is becoming increasingly important as US is the largest exporter of natural gas. And the last thing is training and education. This is a huge problem. It cannot be solved just by a team of 25, 30, 40 people. It has to be something that a lot of people need to start working together on. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to be actively providing training for regulators, for oil and gas companies, and anyone else who wants to use these models. And the goal is to really create a user community of these models so that we're not the ones doing this work for everyone. We are just creating the framework that then anybody can take and start using within their own operations. So how does this actually work in terms of what kind of data we're going to be using? So we take data from oil and gas operators. These are based on measurements. This is operational information. We integrate them with data from various research projects that the Department of Energy is funding. We integrate them with public data, such as the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, the Permian map that was developed by Environmental Defense Fund, and other publicly available information. We put them all through the models and the protocols that we develop. We aggregate and anonymize them, and then we make them public. And what do we make public? Things like measurement-informed inventories across supply chains, across regions, across basins. We'll publish an up-to-date US methane census regularly. And this will get updated by the latest measurement data that's coming in. And then we'll publish basin and asset-wide intensities. There have been 5 or 6 recent measurements in the Permian Basin, and what they measured ranged from as low as 3% to as high as 9%. What's the correct number? So we want to be able to aggregate data from several sources to make sure that we have the best estimate of emissions across different parts of the country. And the goal is to build trust across industry, regulatory agencies, and the public. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to show you examples of what this means and how are we thinking about this modeling exercise and how that's going to be useful in developing improved carbon accounting estimates. The first one is using measurement-informed emissions to estimate life cycle emissions of US LNG supply chains. So one of the things we are seeing right now is that there are significantly higher emissions in the Permian Basin compared to the Marcellus Basin. This is what's leading to differentiated LNG supply chains. And so what you're seeing here is the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions intensity for 2 different shale basins providing LNG to UK and China. So if you're looking at gas that's sourced from the Marcellus Shale Basin, your greenhouse gas intensity is anywhere between 15 and 20, depending on your shipping distance. But if you're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions intensity for gas sourced from the Permian Basin, your intensity is anywhere between 30 and 40 grams CO2e per megajoule depending on your shipping distance. So even within the US, even though our overall methane emissions is about 2%, you can see that the life cycle emissions intensity of LNG supply chains are going to vary quite a bit, depending on where you're getting the gas from. And now with the data that's available, we can do this at the basin level. But what you really want is doing this at individual supply chain levels. So if you know you're getting natural gas from 3 operators in the Marcellus Basin, we can actually do direct measurements across those 3 operators and calculate what the supply chain emissions intensity are for that specific supply chain. Another example, you want to understand, I showed an animation earlier about how methane emissions are very intermittent and short duration. We want to understand what is the frequency of those events and what is the duration. And so here's an example that we recently did. What you're seeing is a picture of an oil and gas production site, a fairly simple site. You have a small number of equipment. We put 3 sensors on the site. And what these sensors are telling us is real-time information on methane emissions. But this is not useful information. It's just raw data on methane. So here's a simulation of what that looks like. So you have a source in the middle, marked by the red triangle. You have winds blowing in all directions, and there's a methane leak. And so the methane leak intersects different sensors along the site. There are about 8 sensors in the diagram as black dots. What you're seeing on the middle are what we see in the sensor. So those are the signals on the sensor, which is what we have as data. Now, if this is all you have, it doesn't tell you anything about what the emissions are, what the intermittency is, what the frequency of those events are. So the challenge is, how do you take data that you see in the middle, just methane concentrations over time, and translate that into useful information? So that's what we did. So we derived frequency of emission event statistics for different oil and gas basins. And this is part of what going from measurements to information is. So what you're seeing here, these 2 graphs are, the left one is the duration of emission events. So you see that most events are very short duration, less than 10 hours in duration. There are very rare events that are maybe a few days long, but most emissions are very short. And if you look at the frequency of these events on the right, most events occur on a daily basis, maybe once a couple of days, but there are also very rare events that happen once every 20 days or once every 25 days. If all you have are data with 1 satellite overpass or 1 aerial measurement, you're just going to get measurement on a given day. You're not going to know, how often that kind of emissions occur. And what we are seeing is that sometimes emissions occur very rarely. So you have to scale your snapshot data with satellites or aerial measurements to accurately account for emissions over a range of time period. So here's an example of emissions from one site. What we find is that, we flew over the site, we found a very large emission, 3,000 standard cubic feet per hour, which is completely out of the ordinary. If you didn't know anything about emission events, you will just add that into your inventory estimates. But what we found is that an event of that size, 3,000 standard cubic feet per hour, are very rare. They happen just 1% of the time. But lower volume events, let's say about 100 standard cubic feet per hour, happens more frequently, 40% of the time. And so if you just do 1 or 2 or 3 measurements, depending on where you find on this distribution, you might measure as low as 0, you might measure 100, or you might measure 3,000. So you need to know how often such events occur. And for that, you need models that must be standardized and universally adopted. So the last example that I'm going to give is using techno-economic models to inform methane regulations. So the FEAST model is something that we developed in our group, the Fugitive Emissions Abatement Simulation tool. And what this tool really does is it just compares the effectiveness of methane reductions using different technologies. So one operator might want to use an aerial system. Someone else might want to use a drone. A third operator might want to use a ground-based system. The question for the regulator is, how much emissions reductions are you going to get, depending on which technology you're using? So because the FEAST model is public and it's peer-reviewed, EPA took the model and used it in their latest methane regulations. And so I'll show you exactly what the EPA did. So what's happened in the past 5 years is that new technologies have been shown to cost effectively monitor, estimate, and help reduce supply chain methane emissions. And so they're also cost effective, which means operators want to use these new technologies as opposed to some other conventional approaches that we have been using in the past, which are just ground-based surveys with handheld cameras. And so we developed the FEAST model to inform what emissions reductions you're going to get by using some of these new technologies. And so why do you need these models? Because the question is very different in terms of what the EPA wants to know. It's not about whether new technologies can detect emissions. Of course, we can do a lot of testing to understand if a drone can see a methane leak, if a satellite can see a methane leak. And we do a lot of that testing at METEC facility in Colorado State University. But the question for policymakers is slightly different. It's about, can a leak detection and repair program with a given technology on a given platform, like a drone, surveying so many times per year in a given basin, under these weather conditions, reduce emissions by 50%? The question on the right is what policies are concerned about. And to be able to do that, you need to develop models to compare different technologies. And so that's what we did the FEAST model. It takes in data on technologies, it takes in data about emissions, it takes in data about the policy details, and what it tells you are the costs and benefits of using different technologies and different leak detection program options. So here's an example. So EPA used this FEAST model to compare emissions reductions from using different technologies for leak detection. So the question was, if you were to replace conventional camera-based surveys with site-wide aerial surveys, what do you need to do? And so EPA developed this table. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but what this table shows is that the EPA essentially came out and said, you can either do 4 times a year monitoring with the old camera-based approach, or you can take some of these new technologies and do different kinds of surveys. And the way they got to this table is they modeled all of the different technologies using FEAST, and then found out which technologies, under what combinations of technologies and survey frequency can you achieve the same emissions reductions. Now, every operator has flexibility in choosing whatever technology they want for reducing methane emissions and still be in compliance with EPA regulations. So I talked a bit about using multi-scale monitoring campaigns to effectively mitigate super-emitters. We have been able to use models like FEAST to think about what are the effectiveness in reducing emissions of these different technologies. So what you're seeing here is an example of that. So what you're looking at are emissions reductions from 0 to 100%. And on the x-axis, you have survey frequency. How often do you look for emissions? And so you can talk about how different technologies, whether it's a satellite or an aerial system or a drone system, how much emissions will it reduce depending on how often you survey. And so this is another example of how models have been useful in moving from data to information. And in this case, the information is about the potential for emissions reductions under given methane policies. So to summarize, models are needed to help interpret measurements to provide useful supply chain emissions information for both markets and policies. Now, what we're seeing with recent policies like the Inflation Reduction Act and voluntary efforts such as differentiated gas markets are going to require accurate supply chain carbon accounting. But as we have shown you, going from measurements to emissions inventory is a challenging problem. You have uncertainty in technology, you have intermittency of emissions, you have sample size constraints. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, and reconciling these measurements with annualized inventory estimates is a complex issue. Interpreting measurements is key to enabling accurate emissions accounting. And the key is this must be done consistently across space, time, and technologies. And we need transparent, scientifically robust, and publicly available community models to move towards a measurement-informed approach to policies. I'm going to end with what I just said when I started. This is not something that one person or one team could do. This is going to be a community effort. We're going to be developing some of these models. We're going to be analyzing all of the data that's coming in, but we want to work with all of you, the audience, to think about how do we move this forward collectively. So the solutions that we need are available next year, not 5 years from now. Thank you.
So Arvind, can you hear us? We're going to try to get some questions from the audience.
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, Arvind. So I was first wondering if you had a list of references, of the papers that you had quoted, especially the ones that that describe your models and the lead up to your models at this time.
Yes, all of our papers are publicly available in preprint servers. We try to get it out as soon as it's ready. The one on blue hydrogen, we are just finalizing it, so it should be out in the next couple of weeks.
Hey, Arvind, thank you very much. This is Mike. You two have met before, but I recently came across hydrogen-related project, right? They make hydrogen from natural gas, and they said that their source of hydrogen was responsibly sourced natural gas. Didn't know what that meant. Went digging for information, can find very little on it. It seems your tools and methods can help inform that, but then I guess, what are your thoughts on RSG, responsibly sourced natural gas, and how we might deal with that in the future?
Right. That's a very important concept. I think the issue of responsibly sourced natural gas and differentiated gas supply is going to become increasingly important as the capabilities of new technologies improve. So we're going to be able to talk about, we're just going to have a satellite point at a facility and say what its methane emissions are at any given time. But we should also exercise caution in this. Given the amount of interest in the space, there's a lot of responsibly sourced gas certifications and other mechanisms that are very opaque. If someone just comes out and says, hey, I certify that you have responsibly sourced natural gas, and they don't tell you how they do that or what kind of data they use to do that certification, nobody is going to be able to trust those certifications. And so this is something that's going to be important and it's going to grow, but we have to make sure that any of these certifications that we use are trusted. And to be able to trust those certifications, we have to know exactly what data goes in. Transparency is going to be key to the success of many of these responsibly sourced gas initiatives.
Other questions?
Just one question. Where in the world are there the greatest fugitive emissions?
Great question, difficult to answer as well, mostly because US is far ahead of almost any other country in terms of measurements. We have a lot more measurements in a lot of different places over a number of years using different technologies that most other countries are just starting to do. That said, based on anecdotal evidence from satellite data, what we have seen are significant methane emissions from oil and gas facilities in Central Asia and Russia.
Deriving, just a follow-on of sorts. I was just wondering about the methane emissions from the permafrost frost melting in Siberia, right? Which is supposed to be one of the biggest kind of new sources of methane emissions. I mean, while you are obviously more fixed on these measurements, in these micro sources and so on, but I was wondering if you or anyone else has looked at that, any models for measuring the spike or increase in those sort of emissions?
So as you suggested, we don't actually do measurements in the Arctic, although some of my colleagues do. The challenge of Arctic methane emissions, permafrost emissions, is more about continuously monitoring this. So there are often news articles about permafrost melt, but they're often localized melts. Whether there's going to be a large-scale melting and therefore a methane release from the Arctic is still an open scientific question. And there are a lot of people working on doing direct measurements at field sites in Alaska, as well as modeling to think about at different temperature levels of the Arctic, what will happen to permafrost methane emissions. But I think it's still in research mode.
have another question.
Yeah, I was wondering about the carbon capture tax credits, the Q45 tax credits. How does the EPA verify that the companies are actually capturing and sequestering that carbon?
That's a great question. And I think that's the exact kind of question that we need to be thinking carefully about. There are a couple of different challenges there. So the first one is how efficient your capture is. This is something that can be measured, carbon capture efficiency. But the second challenge is once you sequester that CO2, you have to make sure that you're sequestering it for over 1,000 years. And so what kind of monitoring systems do you need to have in place to make sure that the CO2 does not leak out of underground reservoirs? There are newer technologies that are being developed and that are being researched to make sure we can monitor sequestration, but again, very early stage because we don't have a lot of CO2 sequestration now.
Any other questions? Well, Arvind, Dr. Ravikumar, thank you for your flexibility. Good luck on your Senate testimony today. And we appreciate